Hi, welcome to this video where I explain an article I wrote together with Jong Brataas. And it was published in the Journal of International Crisis and Risk Communication Research in 2021. And what we try to do is to make the connection between crisis communication and more the psychosocial literature. As you will notice when you read the article, we believe that crisis communication is mostly focused on organizations in the corporate world, but crisis communication might have a really important task to help victims and their families and the next of kin, because you do want to prevent that the crisis communication you do on behalf of an organization or corporation, that it will hurt the victims, especially unnecessarily. And if you communicate in the wrong way, it might cause what we call a source of stress. And sources of stress is just another word for, well, it has some negative psychosocial impact on people. So whatever you do in communication, try to prevent that, because you communicate with in mind maybe the reputation of your organization or your corporation, that it also hurts the people who are really connected to the crisis. So for example, the employees, etc., etc. So try to keep an eye on both stakeholder groups, maybe your own stakeholders, the importance of the customers, etc., etc., but also on the victims and people who really suffer from the incident. So that's what we try to do, because if you search for literature, those are really two different domains: crisis communications on one hand and the psychosocial literature on the other. And what we try to do is to bridge both disciplines, and that's what we did in this article: Victims as Stakeholders: Insights from the Intersection of Psychosocial, Ethical and Crisis Communication Paths. Well, here we explain we want to prevent that crisis communication becomes an additional source of stress to the affected in the aftermath of crisis. And the affected, that's a rather broad phrase, a broad term, but well, as long as people perceive they are affected, then we regard them as being one of the affected. If you suffer from a crisis, this is from the psychosocial insights. Typical effects include stress, fear, uncertainty, physical symptoms, trauma-related mental health problems. And that's what you do not really expect when you talk about crisis communications in the corporate world, but maybe people can suffer from these kind of things. We know, of course, that people will have stress, fear, uncertainty after, for example, natural disasters. If you survive a hurricane or a tornado or floodings, then you have similar symptoms. But of course, those can be the result of a crisis in the corporate world as well. Think of an explosion at a factory or something like that. So we want to help victims, protect potential victims, and that's what Coombs and Holliday also write. But in fact, they do not really tell us how to do that. They just more or less mention that it is important, but they do not give a clue on how to help them. So that's where we potentially find our gap to fill. And what we say, current crisis communication literature more or less has a managerial bias. It is mostly focused on reputation and also on the corporate world, and especially the American corporate world is really dominated by the Western world. That said, from the other discipline, the psychosocial literature, we know that victims look for acknowledgement for the difficult situation they find themselves in. So how can we use crisis communication to support these people? That's more or less the main question of this article. And well, here you see we give the examples from worldwide, what they do after shootings, and etc., etc. Here we refer to Coombs, like, okay, Coombs already states that victims not only should be provided with the expression of sympathy, but also with information about corrective actions and trauma counseling when needed. That with just a small remark, but it is a bit hard. If you say, okay, this is really the purpose of crisis communication, but corrective actions and trauma counseling are not really to the core of crisis communication. So it might be really important, but that's not really what we are educated for. So maybe we use those insights from other disciplines. That's more or less the point we try to make over that. And we do understand it is a challenge to align more the victim-oriented communication with more the reputation-driven communication, because well, they require different elements and yeah, they have a different focus. So maybe what's best for the company might not be best for the victims. In the extreme, maybe for the corporate world after a crisis is the best way to deny you are responsible for it to every extent. So you don't want to take any responsibility for what happened. Well, that may be not the best response or the spokesline for the victims and the families. So here, well, this is what we are going to do. This is typically American, that at the end of the introduction you already give away some of your insights, but it doesn't really matter. Then we approach it from an ethics of care perspective, and that's more or less, it means that sometimes you just need to do what is needed by others, and not just because it's right for you to do it as a company, but it's just more like, okay, try to think of others. What do they really need and what do they expect? And maybe you should take that extra step to support others, even though it's not really necessary for yourself when you are in a crisis. So not because it is legally necessary that you do something, but because, well, you more or less voluntarily want to act. And we give an example of Simola somewhere in this article as well, where Simola explains how that works. Then also we realize that not all victims are exactly behaving exactly the same. Not all victims have exactly the same expectations of the corporation. So that's maybe making things rather difficult, but at least give it a try. Then we turn to Hopful, and Hopful is a really well-known author in the field of psychosocial literature. Hopful et al. This et al., but that's more in the medical sphere. Et al. Means that I think he wrote this article with about 28 other authors. But like to put it simple, Hopful is more or less like what Coombs is in crisis communication, and that Hopful has a similar position in the psychosocial field. And Hopful, he says, okay, after people experience a crisis, there are different sources, potential sources of stress. And if you behave in the wrong way, then these sources of stress will be activated. And there are 5 sources of stress and so-called 5 essential elements to prevent that people will suffer from these sources of stress. So if you do it correctly, you use these elements and you look for every element. Okay, what can I do to give the victims less harm and make the world a bit easier for them. And what we did in this article, together with Jong Brataas, we translated more or less these essential elements, like, okay, this is important from a psychosocial point of view, but how can we contribute to those elements from the point of view of crisis communications? And that's how we set things up. So the first of the essential elements of Hopful is to promote a sense of safety. And you really need to I think, to read it through, but well, maybe you can just communicate about, okay, what lessons did we learn from it, and how did we learn so it won't happen again, so it didn't mean for nothing. How, for example, we can also think of support in media management, because it will give people a sense of safety when they do not feel chased by the local media, but at least we support them in media management, for example. And that's another thing where we believe you can contribute to lower the stress among the affected. Ask the media or use your professional network connections and ask the stakeholders, please, if you have more questions for the affected, please come to us as a government, for example. But they asked us if we can be more or less their spokesperson. Promote calming. That's also educating people on what happens, and that is it's. I think I absolutely like this quote from Hopful, and that's more or less the core of psychosocial psychosocial science. But that's knowing that after a crisis, you are still reacting in a normal way. Is only that you react to an abnormal situation. So it's not really strange that you don't sleep at night and you are awake for 3 weeks. That's just normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So it's not about you, it's about the situation. You are not sick or crazy. I think those just educating, because, well, usually it will be the first time people experience a crisis, so they do not know what to expect, and maybe just providing some of the information on that is already really helpful. They need some guidance on what can we expect, what will be next. But also, well, set up some kind of family assistance center where people can get more information. Calmness. It also means that you stick to the promises made. So you become reliable as an organization in the aftermath of crisis. People know what to expect from you, and especially the victims. Sense of self and collective efficacy. So that's more or less, can you empower people, support them in setting up support groups, so they can discuss with other people who had more or less similar experiences. Do you want to help them, to support them, to set up a monument or memorialize the tragedy, for example, an hour of 1 year after the crisis happened? Promote connectedness. That's also bringing all together for those people who want, and not everyone wants to, but for those people who really are helped by meeting other people who had more or less similar experiences. Maybe you can facilitate them to bring them together, attending memorials, remembrances, or set up museums or other kind of memorials. And also promoting hope. According to Hopful, hope is also an important trigger for people not to experience too many psychosocial stress factors, as long as there is hope for the future that things will turn better. That's maybe also something you can contribute on in crisis communications. So and that comes close to what we know from Seeger, for example. Seeger and I think Selno Ulmer, they wrote about the discourse of the renewal. So like, it's really terrible what happened, but at least we can grow towards a new situation. I think that's closest connected to what Hopful refers to in terms of hope, and what we already the first steps we take on this path in terms of crisis communications. And then we just refer to hope can be provided on both a community and an individual level. We refer to experiences from the floods in Queensland, and etc. etc. Then we try to give some to get it really practical. What are the implications? And there we give the overview. And in fact, this is more or less like a discussion, but we more or less summarize what we've been writing in the earlier stages of the article, in the earlier paragraphs. So prevent, limit unwanted exposure, support them in media management, address concerns, stick to the promises made, etc. etc. So we have quite some interesting things we can offer as a communication discipline. And it's not like that communication has to solve all the problems, but at least we have some contribution to help them and to help the victims and the affected from a psychosocial point of view. And then we go to what are the future directions. There we give some options. I think this is this more or less summarizes the different point of view from when you are looking at crisis communication from a corporate point of view and psychosocial point of view. As we write here, after having survived an airplane crash, survivors might develop a negative brand image of the airline at stake. For example, oh, I'm never gonna fly with KLM anymore. But it is more likely that they develop a general fear of flying, and that's not aimed at one brand specifically. So for KLM, it is maybe really necessary to rebuild their brand, and people will trust the brand afterwards, but that's not the main purpose for crisis communication when you approach it from the point of view of the affected or the next of kin. And that maybe is how, well, as long as you know that they have a different focus, then you know where to start to bring them closer to each other, and that you need to do some things in the corporate world to restore your brand image, but in the meanwhile need to do other things maybe towards the affected and the victims, and they get not disturbed because you publish some kind of an advertisement which hurts the affected in the aftermath of such a crash unnecessarily. Well, here we say, okay, earlier on, Lou, Brooke Fisher Lou, and Fristino already raised the fundamental question: what is the goal of our scholarship? And here we claim that bridging the commercial and reputational interests of organizations and the more private interests of the directly affected is one of such goals. And this might be the first step towards doing more research on how we can bridge that gap. And we believe it is the ethical duty of our scholarship to pay more attention to this point of view, as victims are important group of stakeholders as well. So that's about it. We just refer back to table 1 in the conclusion, where we provide this overview on, okay, really helpful things you can do in terms of communication to support victims and their families. Well, as it is a first guess we set up, we say, okay, maybe have to test it and verify it, whether or not this works, and what next steps are to develop this even further. That's about it. Thank you for watching.